Greetings, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kyla Hannington, and I'm the Public Outreach and Engagement Division Manager with the Prince George's County Office of Human Rights, the county's Civil and Human Rights Education and Enforcement Agency. With me today as co-host is my fantastic colleague, Andrea Lopez Herrera. We here at the Office of Human Rights investigate complaints of civil rights discrimination. We combat human trafficking, we ensure equitable language access to county government services, and we provide community programming on issues related to social justice. So as part of that work, we partnered with the Prince George's County Memorial Library System and the University of Maryland for this new series, Social Justice in Community. Our first event in this series was 2 weeks ago. We had an amazing conversation with Dr. Nicole Deloach on the intersectionality of illness. And today we are delighted to have with us Dr. Kris Marsh on Singlehood is a Human Right. I want to take a minute to give credit where credit is due. It was Dr. Marsh who conceptualized this whole event series. And so it is a particular pleasure to have her with us today as one of the very first guests in this series. Social Justice in Communities looks at how human rights research impacts us, how scholarship on human rights violations or issues of social justice has meaning in our day-to-day lives, and it offers an introduction to what is being discussed, studied, and thought about in universities today. So Dr. Marsh, we are so happy to have you back with us. Dr. Marsh is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Maryland. She received her PhD from the University of Southern California in 2005. She was a postdoctoral scholar at the Carolina Population Center at the University of North Carolina before joining the faculty of the University of Maryland, where she has been tenured since 2014. Her book, The Love Jones Cohort, Single and Living Alone in the Black Middle Class, came out in February. And we were very fortunate to have her talk to us about that at an in-person event earlier this year at the Greenbelt Branch Library. So welcome back, Dr. Marsh.
Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be back with you, especially to talk about singlehood. I'm quite passionate about this subject matter.
Well, we're super happy to have you. I do want to hear, so singlehood as a human right. I'm hoping that you can just kick us off by talking about the title. Like, what are we getting into here?
Absolutely. But before I will get there in 1 second, but before I get there, I can't take all the credit for this. This really was like a collaborative effort. But coming in as the new Director of Graduate Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, it was really important for me that other faculty and students are able to talk to everybody about their research. It's one thing to be able to do a professional conference. It's another thing to be able to come to a public library and be able to make your research accessible. So I'm so excited to be here. I hope that we're going to see students that are going to be coming in the spring. And I want to make my research and all the research that's happening out of the Sociology department accessible to people right here in Prince George's County. So thank you so much for having me. Now, with that being said, singlehood is a human right. I want to talk a little bit about my book and talk about singlehood, but to just kind of give you the take-home message. When we think about singlehood, we often think about singlehood in negative, derogatory, stigmatizing kind of ways. And I want people to think about singlehood in different kind of ways. And we also openly discriminate against single people. So in the book that I wrote, I'm going to talk about my book, but in the book that I wrote, I argue that we have to understand how structural forces constrain personal choices. If I were to say that a little bit differently, I would say we have to think about how racism constrains our personal choices. If I were to give you an example so you can understand what I'm thinking about, if I, Kris Marsh, want to marry another Black heterosexual Black man that has a PhD, owns his own home, has an MBA, and is making $250,000, he's simply not there. So we have to understand how structural forces constrain our personal choices. But then, because certain institutions like the Census Bureau, for example, does not define single people living alone as a family. They define people that are single and living alone as a household. Their definition of family means somebody that you're related to by blood, marriage, or adoption. So if the Census Bureau does not define me as a family and I'm defined as a household, there's three ways in which I think that this is discriminatory. I'm going to give you a benign example, then a more egregious example. So If I want to get the discount on my cell phone plan, I want the family discount on my cell phone plan. I'm not going to get that discount. Students talked about Netflix, how Netflix discriminates too. If I want to go on vacation, single occupancy is going to be more expensive than double occupancy. And then lastly, the one that everybody should possibly shake their head at is the tax structure. There's a singlehood penalty built into the tax structure. One of the things I talk about in my research is that there's a really great book that if anybody's interested, written by Dorothy Brown. She is out of the law tradition. And the argument that she makes is that and the name of the book is The Whiteness of Wealth. One of the arguments that Dr. Brown makes is that people should all file taxes as single. If we don't all file taxes as single, I argue that we should all be able to file as a family. And you should think of people that are single and living alone as a family. And so the fact that people are openly discriminating against people that are single and living alone is a human rights issue, and it's a conversation that we need to have. And people don't even understand how they're discriminated against single people in open site and just don't even acknowledge it. So the book is really trying to acknowledge that and figure out how we can move the conversation forward. Because if we just kind of pull the onion back a little bit, we can see how so many policies really cater towards families. And if families are the unit of analysis and people that are single and living alone are not the unit of analysis, then it becomes a problem. The Census Bureau just put out a study a little while ago, a press release, talking about the rise in singlehood. And in fact, talk about people that were 25 to 54, and I think 44% of them were single, never married. I can't remember the actual percentage, but that means it's a large group, it's happening, and we need to have the conversation about it. So the book is trying to have the conversation. So what I want to do is I want to pivot a little bit and just tell you a little bit about the book. Here is a copy of the book if you want to go and buy a copy of the book. So one of the things, a couple caveats before I talk about the book. Being in Prince George's County, one of the things that's really important to me is that as a scholar, I want to study the Black middle class. There are a lot of scholars that study the Black poor, and I believe there's a reason and a need to study the Black poor. But there's also a Black middle class. As we know, Prince George's County for years was the wealthiest Black county in the country. If you don't know, Charles County just slightly outpaced us of being the richest Black county in the country. So there is a thriving Black middle class right here in Prince George's County and across the country. And I really wanted to learn more about the Black middle class. So I wanted to specifically look at those that were single and living alone in the Black middle class. Part of the reason why I wanted to write this book also, is because I was so tired of having this conversation. Why aren't professional Black women getting married? That becomes almost like a deficit model. It doesn't matter what these Black women are doing, as long as they're not partnered and not married, that's all that matters. So I wanted to extend the conversation and say, hey, I'm a demographer, which means I just look at demographics and I study demographics. And what we do know is that marriage rates have changed for all racial and ethnic groups, but it's way more pronounced for Blacks and Black women in particular. But what do we know about people that are single and living alone? We don't usually extend the conversation. It stops at, why aren't you married? We know they're not married, so why don't we talk about what they are doing? Some of the things I really wanted to know what they were doing. I wanted to know where they lived. Where did they decide to live? I wanted to know if they were single and living alone, would they be discriminated against in the housing market because they don't have a partner and they weren't thought of as an attractive person to rent to, or actually as a homeowner, where they thought of as not being as attractive because they don't have a partner. I wanted to know their level of interaction with their community members. Do community members look at the single person at the end of the block and say, oh, that's the creepy, weird person at the end of the block? Do we have open biases, openly implicit, explicit biases towards people that are single and living alone? I also wanted to know, okay, so if we think about like the life course, you go to, in some cases, you go to college, you get married, you have a partner, you have children, you buy a house. Here's people that have stepped over some of these stations on the life course. So I really wanted to know like how singles were buying homes. When were they deciding to buy homes? How were they accumulating wealth? Was it only in homeownership? Did they have access to other forms of wealth? I also was really fascinated with how singles disseminate their wealth. Because if we think about how wealth is usually transferred from parent to child, and the second largest household type in the Black middle class in my book are single and living alone, how are they going to transfer their wealth? It becomes a really interesting conversation and question. And some of the respondents in the book talked about how they're going to transfer their wealth. And they talked about, this is where friends played a central role in the conversation. Having friends helped a lot of the people in the book that I wrote and the people that I interviewed for the book navigate singlehood. Oftentimes we think about marriage and we put all of our eggs in the marriage basket. So we put all of our time and energy and effort into the one that we're going to be partnered or married with, and we forsake our friends. And a lot of the people in the cohort talked about how friends were really important to them. And I would admonish everybody, single and or married, do not forget your friends, because your friends will be there for you. But it really is important to always nurture the relationships. Do not put all of your eggs in the marriage basket, because that's daunting on the marriage. And that means the marriage has to be everything. Keep your friendships, cultivate your friendships, extend friendships, even if you are married, because you don't know if you're going to return back to singlehood. There's research out there that talks about and suggests that people that are long-term never married tend to be and can be happier. Why? Because they built networks. They have friends to go to church with, to go to brunch with, to go golfing with. But sometimes other people who are married don't have those same friendship networks, and they put everything into the marriage basket. And then when they find themselves returning to single, they just actually don't know how to navigate. And as they age, they don't have as positive outcomes of people that are never married and are long-term never married and built networks. So I also wanted to think about, like, how do they navigate their mental and physical health. I was like, so you're single. Do you have more time to work out, less time to work out? So I really just wanted to extend the conversation in different ways and really talk about what they are doing. Because if we think about singlehood and keep asking the question, well, why aren't you married and why don't you have any children? It becomes a deficit model. And that's not the kind of research that I want to do. I want to be very clear that it's not always the fault of the individual. And one of the arguments, a strong argument that I make in the book, is that when we think about singlehood, it's important to have a structural conversation about singlehood. If we look at people that are single and say, ooh, there's something wrong with you. Look, you're not smart enough. You're not pretty enough. You're not thin enough. You're not fat and heavy enough. Whatever it may possibly be, it's an individual conversation. But that is short-sighted. We have to understand, especially when we're thinking about in Black America, we have to think about how structural forces actually constrain people's individual choices. There are some people that are choosing to be single. They want to be single. They decide they don't want to date. And that's perfectly fine. I respect and appreciate their perspective. But it's also important to have a 30,000-foot conversation and talk about how structural forces actually have constrained people's personal choices. So those are some of the main components that I talk about in the book. There's 4 broad implications that I hope that the book does make. The first one is that the singlehood scholarship is on the rise in the States as well as globally. There's a lot of scholarship around singlehood, but unfortunately, what it appears like to me is that the singlehood scholarship has taken a white gaze or a white face. So in other words, you have the rise of like white people and white women in particular that are choosing to be single. So the scholarship tends to have a white gaze, and I'm pushing back quite hard in the book and saying, if we look at it, at the data from 1950 until the present, we can see that Blacks dominate the single category. Black women in particular dominate the single category. So I want to make sure that Black women are thought of as the trailblazers in this global movement that's happening towards singlehood. And them being the trailblazers, we can't ignore them from the conversation. And I'm going to age myself. Some of you all will get this reference. Some of you absolutely will not get this reference, and it's okay. But I think about how single parenthood was pathologized when it was Black women that were single parents. And then for the old heads that get it, then there was Murphy Brown, and Murphy Brown became a single parent. It's a sitcom. She became a single parent, and it was in vogue. It was sexy. It was the hot thing to do. I feel what's kind of happening, the same thing's kind of happening in the singlehood scholarship. You have non-Black women there's a rise in singlehood among non-Black women. It's among globally, around everybody. But Black women are getting lost in the conversation. So I want to make sure that we understand that Black women are the trailblazers for this social phenomenon that's happening globally. Number 2, I really want us to think more about how we look at singles and whether or not we look at them as single by choice or single by force, and whether it's an amalgamation of both. But more importantly, I think it's really important for us to understand sometimes it has nothing to do with the individual. It really is structural forces, and we have to acknowledge those structural forces. The third one, which relates to the structural forces, if we understand that structural forces constrain personal choices, and then you do not allow people that are single and living alone to be defined as a family, that's discrimination, and that is a human rights issue, and we need to have conversation around that. If you think that in your mind, if you're saying, oh no, Dr. Marsh, you have to be related to somebody or in relationship with someone to be considered a family. The other broad implication I'm trying to make in my research is that if you don't buy my argument about being a family of one, we should institutionalize augmented families. And I'm drawing from some earlier sociological work. And what I mean by augmented families is I'm talking about people that you are in relationships, but it's non-romantic, nurturing relationship. So I think we need to institutionalize the value of these friends, and they need to be legally recognized. So two people that are in non-romantic, nurturing relationships should be able to be developed as an institution for a couple of reasons. One, for estate planning. Two, for medical decisions. And three, for later in life decisions. If people that are really close to someone and they want to develop a family, we should be open to that. Family should not only be someone that you're related to by blood, marriage, or adoption. So those are the four main contributions that the research is actually trying to make. And again, this is the book. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it it's also on audio. You can get it on audio and you can get it on Amazon. It's audio.
Yeah, so I put links for people who are watching. There's a link to Dr. Marsh's website in the chat where you're watching. It's Dr. Kris, KrisMarsh.com, DRKrisMarsh. Oh, I'm going to stop. I'm just going to put it on the screen. You don't need to hear me say that again. But you can get there and again, get the links. The book just came out in audio. I don't know if you said that in August. So brand new audio book coming out there. I'm jumping in. I have a question.
Yes.
Actually, I have a couple of questions. But one of the things at the end, you got to a place that I'm so interested by, and I want to talk more about this. When you talk about the institute, I'm just looking over here for people who are watching, also for you, Dr. Marsh. I'm taking my notes over here on this screen. So when I look, I want you to know it's just my notes. Okay. But you talk about the institutionalization of augmented families. And as you were talking, I'm going to be honest, I'm listening and trying to learn from you and also think about what's my argument against what you're saying. So as you're talking, I'm listening and I'm thinking.
Why does there have to be an argument against it?
Well, no, I'm just talking. I'm gonna be honest. I'm like, what am I taking in? And I was thinking as you're talking and the families, I thought, well, do people live in the same house? And then as I was thinking, because I was following along with you, it was like, well, no, because we have people who are families who don't live in the same house. You have people who are married and get married benefits who live in different houses. And so I was so interested, and I love this idea. And I know people who are in this category, which you're speaking about, very close friends, non-romantic friends, very close friends who really, should be considered domestic partners for every type of legal framework, and as estate planning, medical decisions, care. And so, what I'm wondering about is what do you think is the limitation? Is it just this kind of married normalness, this married framework that is probably heteronormative to a great extent, but also married normative?
Yes. So yes. People have this idea of what family should be, and they normalize marriage as part of this understanding of family, and they're not willing to even be open to the conversation or the discussion. Mm-hmm. So I have a colleague of mine who read my book and called me. We had a 2-hour conversation. She's like, we argued, we had a debate for 2 hours. And one of the things that she said is that, I don't think you're really arguing for family. You don't, it's not about family. It's about the advantages that come with family. So if people get caught up on the word and they really don't want to change family because they're a traditionalist and they want to be critical of words and know that words evolve and should evolve, I can be open to that conversation. But we also have to be open to the conversation. If it's not about defining family more broadly and more inclusive, then people that don't have these families should still be able to get the benefits of a family. If they do not get the benefits of a family, this is when we start thinking about singlehood is a human right, and we need to have this kind of conversation. Ideally, I would like for us to be more inclusive of the word family and include other types of family. But at a minimum, you at least have to have the advantages. At least you have to have the advantages.
One of the things that came up as you were talking, and I've read your book, and so I had the interview, before with you, and hearing this presentation again, I was thinking about the idea, as you're talking about the structural forces. What I actually wrote this down. I tried to make a note of your structural forces constrain choices.
Yes.
And as one of the things I remember from the book, and please correct me and for the viewers, and is that there's a mixture. There are people who are single because they want to be, they're living life is awesome. I want to be single. I'm having a great life. And there are people who maybe would like to find a partner if these forces were not constraining choices. Is that your experience that there's both parties out there?
Yeah, so it can be both and. So there's some people that are like, okay, I'm single, but I kind of really, some people are like, I'm single, I'm loving it, I don't really want to do it. A lot of women in the group that were single, there were some that said, I do hope that I'll get married or I'll partner, but I'm not going to settle. And I think that's important to understand. Some people want to be in this category, some people don't want to be in this category. So regardless if you want to be in this category or you don't want to be in this category, we also have to have a much broader conversation about how your choices have been constrained. Right. And that is the part that's often missing, because we want to say something's individually wrong with you if you're single, but that's not how that works. There's a structural conversation that is often ignored. And that's where I'm really trying to push for, is more of the structural conversation. So it can be both and. Your dating choices can be constrained and you're happy with being single. Your dating choices can be constrained, but you really wish that they were there because you really want to be married and partnered.
Okay. So yeah. I mean, Andrea, I could just keep going. Andrea, do you want to jump in? Do you want to keep going? Okay, I'm going to keep. Okay.
No, I'm just listening right now.
Okay, all right.
I want to do just chime in about, because I do think it's really kind of important though, and we already sometimes think about singles in negative kind of ways, and I get that. I don't want to say I get that. I talk about that ad nauseum in the book. But for the singles that are listening, I also think it's really important that, because you are single, and if you are middle class, you have any kind of assets, you want to make sure you know exactly where your assets are going to go. You are innovators in this process because you don't have children and you don't have a partner. You can decide where your assets are going to go. If you want to uphold Black institutions and give money to sororities, fraternities, historical Black colleges and universities, then so be it. But I think especially when you're single, you want to make sure you have something in place that will establish exactly where your assets go, no matter how little or how much you have.
Yeah, that's really important. Really. Yeah. Actually, on that note, what about for people who are single and for things like medical power of attorney or decision making? Is that to take us through what kind of additional layers are there for people to make those kinds of decisions and appoint people and get people on board?
Well, see, that's where I think it's really important that we have these augmented families and they're actually institutionalized. So it's much easier when you're putting your will and living trust together, that this is my family. So if this is my family, it's institutionalized. It clearly just kind of is next in line. Even if you don't have time to put these materials in place, because they are your family, by default, they can have the ability to advocate on your behalf. And so we just need to, family in and of itself, all I'm asking people to do is think two ways. One, is the term family antiquated? And two, after reading this book, I hope you're just as likely to ask somebody, why are you single, as you are to ask somebody, why are you married? We often ask single folks, why are you single? But we don't ask married folks, why are you married and why do you have children? Please understand, I am not anti-marriage. In fact, I say in the very beginning of the book, I'm pro-marriage, I'm pro-love, I'm pro-Black love, all of that. But I think we're privileging marriage. Perfect example. I think this is going to air today, so it's before Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is coming up. And in the book, the respondents talked about how for the holidays, they had to get their narrative together when they would go to family events and explain why they're single. Right. First of all, Family, stop asking single people. Ask everybody or ask nobody, but don't just openly discriminate and ask one and not ask the other. And for singles, you don't have to have a narrative. When someone asks you, why are you single? One of the most benign things that you can respond back to people is to say, what do you mean by that?
Mm-hmm.
It forces people to then say, oh, well, they're probably going to stutter. They're probably going to stammer. And then they're probably going to say, I'm like, no, my entire pedigree does not matter to you. But the only thing you said to me is, why are you single? So I think it's well within our rights to say, what do you mean by that? And keep pushing until people understand the error in their ways. But I do hope two things. One, we think about, even to understand why we think about singles in a negative way. Why? Stop thinking about them in a negative way. And then think about family. Like, is family exclusionary? And should we continue to use the term that's exclusionary, or should we broaden the term that does include people that are single and or in these augmented families?
I was really, and like, as you're talking about discrimination, here we are, Office of Human Rights, and I was gonna say we love discrimination. We don't love discrimination, but we love working to fight discrimination. And so talking about this and really, like, I really appreciate this. I really appreciate you pointing things out. I made notes as you were talking, and I'm just gonna go back and talk about them. So family discount, like, and Netflix. And
yeah, I don't know. I don't have Netflix, so I don't know how it works. But I did a presentation, and students were coming up with other ways in which singles are being discriminated against. So I was like, yeah.
So. I mean, I'll speak to Netflix. We have, I have 2 children, and we have one Netflix account. My 2 children, by the way, Netflix, if you're listening, stop listening now. My 2 children live in different places. One lives in Wisconsin, one lives at university, and they can access my account. And I'm not sharing. It's not legal to share the password. Well, I'm not sharing the password. They're part of my family. Ergo, they can just use my Netflix. And so that's an example. So we have one account that benefits 3 people versus 3 different accounts, right? So that's, and then I thought, your vacation, single versus double occupancy, and that the housing market, like, how are people treated? You're talking about, Black women coming to get a mortgage, and how are they being received or treated because there isn't the partner along with them. I thought those were all really, really good points that I'm wondering how many people listening, if they're not living as a single person themselves, how many of us would imagine those kinds of areas of discrimination?
Right. And I think I also mentioned this part too. I was like, so what do you think about the single person at the end of the block? Is that the weird single person at the end of the block? We have like these very stereotypical negative views about that single person.
Like, what's wrong?
Yeah, what's wrong with them? I was like, so you're trying to liken this to an individual conversation, but you can't broaden the conversation out to think about how structural forces have just constrained their choices, and they chose not to settle, and they're just not married. Right. Like, yeah. So I think interacting with neighbors is something we need to think about too. And here's why I think that this is really important, because people may not always understand racism. People may not always understand sexism. If we all live long enough, God willing, we will all understand what it's like to be discriminated against because of our age. So ageism, all experience. But we've all been single. Every single one of us has held the title of single. So some of us opt out, or we're able to married or partnered out of the category. So why are we still looking at singles in a negative way? You were single. So it's really important that we just kind of pause and think about why we have these biases towards single people. I also think a thoughtful question, again, I am pro-marriage, but I think a really thoughtful question is, why do you want to be married?
Yeah, right.
And we've been conditioned from a very young age that we're supposed to be married, you're supposed to have children. Like, so why do you actually want to be married? It's an easy question. It's a short question, but I think it's a very complicated answer. And people should pause and understand why they want to be married, because you've been told that from a young age.
Right.
Yeah.
Dr. Marsh, do you think that people in certain professions are looked down upon more if they're single than in other professions if they're not?
I think across the board, people are stigmatized for being single. But to your exact question, I did an op-ed piece. Side note, because this is so important to me, I did not know that an op-ed meant opposite the editorial page. I thought an op-ed meant an opinion editorial. Just found out that
too.
No, it means opposite the editorial page. I am today years old, didn't know that. But to your point, Andrea, Dr. Andrea, Tim Scott, a senator from South Carolina, was indicted because he was single, and they thought he would not be good as a president. So MSNBC actually asked me to write an op-ed opposite the editorial page about singlehood and Tim Scott. If you can, please put the link up, because I really talk about how why does your marital status have anything to do with your occupation, your profession, and what you want to do. So I think everybody's all people are stigmatized as being single, and I don't know if certain occupations are more stigmatized than others. But what I do know is there's some data to suggest that men in particular are wearing wedding rings so that they can appear as if they're married, and so they won't be as openly discriminated against. That's a super duper great question.
So I did just put the link. The MSNBC link is in the chat wherever you're watching. Hopefully you have it. And if you didn't get it
didn't come up on my screen.
No, it's just in the chat for people who are watching at home.
Okay.
This is it. I'll put it up just really quick so people, it's right there, but it's going to be in the chat where you're watching. If for some reason you're not seeing it, if you Google Dr. Kris Marsh, MSNBC, it'll be the first hit for you.
But it's so unfortunate. I mean, I don't care where you sit in his politics. I don't care. But I do care that, like, you're trying to figure out whether or not he is worthy to be president because he's single. The last couple of presidents we've had, most of our presidents were married. Now, how about we try something different? I think our only president that wasn't married was Buchanan. So I'm like, I think that your marital status should have nothing to do with, or your single status should have nothing to do with any occupation. And I do think that you're discriminated against because you're single, whether or not you're a medical doctor, you're a PhD, you're a clergy. You make a whole set of assumptions when you're single.
It seems like singlehood and you talked about, like, if we're all fortunate enough, we'll experience age discrimination, we're going to live long enough.
We're fortunate enough that we live to be older, right?
So someone's going to quote me on this, and it's going to be a problem. I hope I understood what I meant, but that we, and I've heard that also about disability, right? That we're only temporarily abled, that all of us will go through a period, and just. But I was thinking about this with singlehood in that regard, was that for people who, again, maybe people who are married or partnered, long-term partnered, living with someone in a family as recognized currently.
Right.
You started off single, but also a lot of us are going to end up single, right? Like, right? Like that none of us, so it's not just, we all have, this is a condition that all people experience. It's a question of how long they experience it for. Maybe it's for their whole life, and maybe it's for a period of life. And so it really does have this question about, like, how did family, and again, in this very narrow, because I love your idea of that we need to talk about family in a new way, right? Like that family, or recognize family in a new, legally recognize family in a new way, because we talk about the family you make. These are expressions we use all the time about our friend groups, right? My chosen family. But to have that recognized in an institutional way, these families, and it's making me wonder about how did it become that married was normative? Because as you say, people don't say, "Why did you get married?" as if that's unusual. Like, why aren't you married? How did this become a normative that we consider and not equally normative, right? Like a better normative status. Can you speak to that? Do you know about how we got into this situation?
I don't know that I know the history all that well. And I don't think I kind of tease that out in the book all that much. But I do think the larger point that you're kind of making is really true. It's like, at the end of the day, there's a certain kind of family type, and you need to be married. And we're talking about what's better. You need to be in a mother, father, 2.5 child, and a dog kind of family. Anything out of that seems to be considered not normal and not well accepted. We now are moving more towards same-sex relationships and marriages and partnerships. When will we get to a point where we also appreciate and accept being in a family of one? It challenges us to think differently, but the term family should evolve, and has evolved, and should continue to evolve.
I'm just going to switch streams just for a minute. One of our viewers had asked a couple of questions, actually. This is Miss Vivian, who's been a really faithful event attendee with the library, Prince George's County Memorial Library System, for quite some time, and then also has been therefore, because we do a lot with the library, has also joined us in a lot. And she's actually asked a few questions throughout the conversation, but I'm going to put out a couple to do with the book, really just. So the first one is, did you like writing the book? And then secondly, she also wants to know about your research. If you can just talk a little bit about the book process for Miss Vivian, that would be awesome.
No, so Miss Vivian, thank you for the questions. No, I did not like writing the book. I did not realize that professors had to do as much writing as we had to do. Had I have known that as a professor I had to do this much writing, I would have probably gotten a master's degree in journalism or literature or something like that, or literature, because I did not realize how much writing I would have to do. It took me 7 years to write this book because I wanted to make sure I did a thoughtful job with the narratives from the respondents. So talk a little bit about how I collected the data. I collected the data in 2015, and I collected data from 62 respondents, 43 women and 19 men. The interviews happened either on the University of Maryland's campus or it happened at the choosing of the respondents' choice, wherever the respondents chose. We then, after we recorded their interviews, we got consent. We recorded their interviews. Then we had to transcribe everything that the respondent said. So as they're saying it in our ear, we have to type it down on a piece of paper. Some interviews lasted an hour. Some interviews lasted over 3 hours, and we had to transcribe all of that data. And then as a researcher, I had to step back and see what are the trends and what are the common things that all of the respondents are saying. And it wasn't easy. It took me 7 years to write it. I'm happy that it got done. I did not think, sometimes I thought it would not get done. The first draft of the book, I sent it out to my reviewers because it's an academic book. So for academic books, they have to be peer reviewed by scholars in the field to make sure that it's sound. And so my first set of reviews for the book I got were 15 pages, single space of all the things I had to do on the book. Just to contextualize it, people typically get about 2 or 3 pages of revisions. I got 15 pages, single spaced. I was devastated when I got my revisions, but I did it. I got through it. I'm much happier with the product that I have now than I had at the beginning. So if you do buy the book, there's 2 ways in which I want you to think about reading the book, Vivian and anybody else that is listening, is on this call. I want you that the introduction and chapter 1 are theoretically dense. I do engage with a lot of theory in those chapters. If you're a theory person, you're in heaven because it's great. If you're not a theory person, chapters 2 through 10 read very differently. I wrote chapters 2 through 10 for a lay audience. I did not and do not want to be the kind of academic that only writes to academic, because that means I've disenfranchised an entire group of people. If the people that are on this library call right now are not academics and they can pick up my book and learn something from it, my colleagues will respect it. But if I write to my colleagues, I've disenfranchised some of the members that come to the library, and I was not willing to do that. So I gave the academics 2 chapters, and I gave the lay audience 8 chapters. So I do hope that you enjoyed the 8 chapters. Also, as a professor, I'm constantly trying to teach people new things. And so I use footnotes as a way to teach people new things. So if you do pick up the book, or if you do listen to the book, be sure and listen to the footnotes and or read the footnotes, because some of the things I just want to teach you as a sociologist, in case you may not know, are actually in the footnotes. So this is kind of a heads up on how to read the book if you do decide to read the book.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And also for everybody, anybody else watching, please feel free to type any questions that you have into the chat, and we will share them with Dr. Marsh as we can.
One of the things I want to talk about really quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go for it.
Talking about being sensitive to the data, I had to be sensitive to what my respondents said. So overall, the respondents were okay with being single. They were. Some of them wished they were married, but they weren't willing to settle, and they were still living their lives. There were some that did talk about loneliness. But when they talked about loneliness, you're welcome, Vivian. When they talked about loneliness, they talked about loneliness in a situational or a very short period of time. They didn't talk about this debilitating loneliness whereby they're pulling the covers up over their head, they're pulling down the blinds, and they're not coming out of the house for 6 weeks. They did not talk about that. They talked about being lonely around like major holidays, like Valentine's Day was one time, or like even New Year's Eve, where you always want to have somebody to kiss. And they talked about how they were lonely. So I want to make sure that I am balanced in what I say. Overall, very happy, had situational loneliness, small times of loneliness. But then getting back to the point that I was making earlier, friends helped them through that situational loneliness or that point of loneliness. And the next day they were good, they were fine. But it's baffling to me when people think like, okay, well, I'm lonely, I may not be feeling good, so let me go get married. Why do people think marriage is going to be the panacea for all of your ills? I would argue that the worst thing to do is to be married and still feel like you are alone. And so we have to think about how we think about marriage and what we expect marriage to do.
Yeah, you just hit on something. I've said that before. I think that there's nothing lonelier. There is nothing lonelier than being lonely in a marriage or lonely in a group of people where you feel like you should be, with friends. But I think the marital loneliness is real. We have a comment here from Audrey. The distinction of who gets to be in a family and defined as a family goes back in American history to the end of slavery and Reconstruction. And it's interesting to see how this is an issue today too.
Yeah. And it continues to be an issue. And as I'm not going to say where I was, but I was somewhere just yesterday having this conversation. They were pushing back about the idea of family and like how family is about connection. And I'm like, is that really where we are?
I do find that interesting because like what I was saying earlier, like I hear people all the time talk about my chosen family, and they're not talking at least in the context in which I personally have heard this, is people talking about their friend group.
Right.
They're not talking about their chosen family like their spouse or their children, as opposed to their family of origin. They're talking chosen family as their friends. And so it's like, this seems like something that we articulate individually, but we don't systemically accept.
Right. So like the argument that they were making yesterday, they were saying, okay, you have to be in relationship with someone to be considered a family. Now you can have like your chosen family, your augmented family, but to be considered like the Marsh family, I have to be in connection with someone else. And I am actually opposed to that. I'm like, nope, I am in connection with myself. I do have my chosen family. I have my augmented family. I have my extended Black family. I was like, but I also stand as a family of one. And people don't buy that argument. Some don't buy that argument.
So what do you think? Is it just that we just can't wrap our minds around? Like, what do you think the resistance is for people?
I think to the conversation I was having yesterday, family connotes relationship. And I'm like, well, why can't we have the relationship with ourselves? The best relationship you can have with anybody is yourself first before anybody else. And so people just think that it suggests relationships, and because a family of one does not suggest a relationship with another person, then it should not be considered a family.
Oh, I want to take time, and Andrea, no, do you before I take time, Andrea, do you want to? You good? Okay.
Real quick though, the reason why this conversation is important, I don't care where the listeners land in this conversation, but what I do care is that we step back and think about policies, and there's policies that have family explicitly labeled in the policy. And that's family leave. Does that include me? Like, where do I fall into that conversation? Right. We need to think about this policies and the implications by having family defined so narrowly.
Well, and this does lead in, because I wanted to talk about, I don't want to avoid this. I think it's really important to talk about, you talk about structural forces, and I think you're speaking specifically, and the quote was structural forces that they relate to choices, but I think we're talking, it's big, what you just said too, like what are the structures that are constrained, what are the structural forces that contain choices? And then and also these structures that have built-in discrimination.
Yeah, there's implications from structural forces constraining personal choices. Right. And the implications are, I'm now not married, I'm not partnered, I can't be defined as a family. So some of these policies don't even include me or even see me.
Right.
And that's where we need to think about the policy. It's almost so easy that we overlook it. But I'm trying to get us to pause and be like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, let's think about this for a second. Mm-hmm. It's almost so in our face that we just don't even see it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think like during COVID, there was like some family relief for COVID as well, some kind of policy for family relief.
I can speak to that because I'm pretty sure I got some money from the government for having children. Just saying.
And I'm glad you said that, because one of the things in the book, so glad you said that. So glad you said that. Because one of the things that they talk about, the respondents in the book talk about, and the data is pretty clear. I'm drawing from a study that was done with the Washington Post and Kaiser Foundation. And what they found is that for Black women in particular, when you're single, your checkbook and your time, it becomes the extended family checkbook and time. So what I mean by that, when you're single, it's like, well, we're going to ask Kris for the money because we're not taking food out of the mouths of her partner nor her children. Right. We're also going to ask Kris to take the grandmother to the podiatrist. Don't even know what a podiatrist is, but have Kris take the grandmother to the podiatrist because Kris doesn't have a partner or children to manage or to work with or to navigate. Mm-hmm. And so I'm like, if anybody needs some financial benefits during COVID or something like that, it could be me, because I have a goddaughter that I'm taking care of sometimes. I have nieces and nephews. I have extended nieces and nephews. I have social nieces and nephews. I would like to get a little break on some of that as well.
Right.
To fall into the policy. So I'm ignored. And the giving that I give to my extended family is kind of ignored.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's really interesting and really important. I mean, Andrea, you good?
Yeah.
Get that ready? Okay.
No, I think what's most interesting to me is how you're almost punished for being single in like taxes or things like that. And it's like, okay, that's not like that just kind of, I've always thought that was like, if you're single, you get taxed more, you get more taken out. And I'm just like, okay, well, I didn't choose this, but okay.
Right. And that's kind of the point. It's like, okay, so you know that I didn't choose this. You know that structural forces have constrained my dating choices, and that man that I want to marry, the woman that I want to marry is just not there. And then from there, I'm discriminated against. That's insidious to me. Mm-hmm. And I'm just saying, people, it's so clear that people just don't even see it. So the book helps you to actually see it and then decide what you're going to do. I would argue like anybody that's a part of some kind of institution needs to go back and look and say, how do our policies openly discriminate against people that aren't in families? I would admonish anybody on this call to do that. The library system, like think about, I'm not saying this is the case, but just think about it. Do we have policies that benefit families? And can I be a family of one? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For us to think about.
And that's actually where I was going to go, is I wanted to talk about, okay, so for people watching now, or if you're tuning in later, what are some takeaways for us? You know, like, I think what you're saying, I mean, I know for me, and I know when we met in person to talk about the book in Greenbelt, one of the things I was saying then is like, it really read like there's so much, you know, that resonates for me. And I'm not a Black single woman in the middle class, like and yet these stories, you know, I connected with some of the experiences, but also recognizing, we've talked about now, like some of the ways of discrimination, and you opening, you know, reading the book and having this conversation out, it's like, oh, I see it. And I don't necessarily think, as my kid in Wisconsin is on my Netflix account, and I don't feel like I've illegally shared my password. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think about it until, you know, you open my eyes, and I appreciate that. But so for those of us watching, like, what are things we can do? What are takeaways are there action items or takeaways from this that you would like us to have?
Yeah, and I think I just kind of gave you some takeaway, but I'll kind of reiterate those. The first thing is, I want you to ask yourself, how do you look at singles? Mm-hmm. And I think it's very important. The second thing is, like, let's be consistent. We're going to be consistent. Either we're going to ask everybody or we're going to ask nobody. Stop asking people why you're single if you're not also going to ask people, why are you married? When we keep doing that and only asking single folks, we continue to privilege marriage.
Right.
Third, I want us all to stop, pause, and think about how we define family individually, but any institution and structure that we are associated with, think about the way in which we define family and look at the policies in any of these institutions and structures that we are associated with, and think about how they have policies that include families. And if these policies include families, do they also include people that are single and living alone? It's an easy lift, but it can have real world benefits if we actually just take this time to pause, stop, and think about it.
I'm thinking of something that I see like with airlines, for instance, if there's a death in your family, and it's a fairly tight definition of family, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. I'm not looking at any airline policies right now as I speak, but I think it's like mom, dad, brother, sister, child. You know,
Right.
I don't think it's aunt and uncle, grandparent. Like, I think it's this very close relationships. But as we're talking today, it's like we recognize, I mean, you can have equally close, meaningful relationships, or like deep, 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 close partnerships
Right.
with a friend that is not your romantic partner, but is a deep life partnership.
Mhm.
And that is a way. That's just as we're talking about ways in which there's this discrimination, is like that relationship is somehow less
Interesting.
valuable,
Right.
or
Right.
or less honored.
It's less honored, it's less valuable, it's not thought of as being traditional or normal, so it's ignored and it's excluded. So I do think that if we're not going to, I think it's both and, right? We should have a family of one. We should also have augmented families and have them institutionalized.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I guess the argument could be, oh, well, they might break up or something like that, but can't marriages break up?
I was going to say, like, yeah.
Like friendships break up all the time. And I appreciate the book because I've had some therapists in Maryland, in DC, and they're like, thank you, Dr. Marsh, for the book. Because I'm kind of saying, you know, we have all of these benefits for married folks. So if your marriage gets a little crunchy, you can go to a marriage and family therapist, you can work it out. But we don't have a lot of therapists that prioritize friend breakups, because you have friend breakups too. I have a friend that I lost 30 years ago, 20 years ago, because she was a dog person and I wasn't a dog person, and we couldn't quite, we haven't talked in years because her dog passed away, and I just sent a text. I didn't know I was supposed to call and or jump on a one-way flight to LA. So we just don't talk anymore. But I really wish that we could go to a therapist and kind of work through that, because I really honestly miss my friend. But we don't value and we don't privilege, and we don't normalize friendships and the value we need to put on non-romantic nurturing relationships.
Do you have, can you hold your book up? I keep looking because I have it, but I don't have it in arm's reach. I'm trying to reach it over there. Okay, so this is actually a really, really interesting, fascinating book. And as you can hear from our conversation today, there's a lot of research in it and conversation in it that is so relevant to what we're doing and to the decisions that we're making. So I really want to encourage everybody who is watching to get a copy from your favorite independent bookstore, and also our friends, Prince George's County Memorial Library System, who are one of our wonderful partners for this event, and so many other events. I also have copies that you can take out if you're not in a position to buy one yourself. We are going to close up here in just a minute, but I want to ask a question before we go to Dr. Marsh or Andrea. Do you have any closing thoughts or questions before we go?
No, I really enjoyed the conversation. It's really a lot of knowledge, and it's something a lot of people don't think about. So, I just appreciate, having you here, Dr. Marsh. So thank you.
It's a pleasure. And I do hope that people just, I don't care where you sit in the conversation, if you agree or disagree. I hope just at a minimum, you stop, pause, and think about where you fit in this conversation and where you agree and where you don't agree. But at least pause and have the conversation. And thank you so much for saying independent bookstores. I always default to Amazon. I apologize for that. But I do know that it's at Busboys and Poets. The book is there.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, I do try to support independent bookstores. So I apologize for using Amazon.
I mean,
I want to go on record saying that, especially to the independent bookstores out there. My bad.
I really wanted to take a minute before we go to talk about this series and to just make sure that people who are watching are aware of what's coming, because it is fantastic. And I appreciate Dr. Marsh giving credit, that's not only you, but from, you were the one who brought it to us, and we are so grateful for this because it is really extraordinary. And so for the people watching, here's what's going to be happening. And we hope that you can join us starting in late January. I think the last Thursday in January, and going all the way through the first Thursday in May, actually, we are going to continue this series every single week, 2 to 3 p.m. We are welcoming scholars, students, all of these wonderful thinkers from the University of Maryland, who are talking about social justice and community. And as I said in the opening, really looking at, how is this research? I mean, I think, Dr. Marsh, I'm going to misquote you, but when we had this conversation with you to talk about this, it was kind of like, how do we get it out of the ivory tower and into community? And so people realize a couple couple of things. First of all, so all of you watching, hey, what's going on out there? What are people thinking about? And I think really let's also just name it. How does it impact me? Why is it relevant? What's the impact to me? And what can I take away? And so this is we are so excited about this program. And so for everybody watching, please just, stay tuned. Join in with us again the last Thursday in January, every single week, all the way through to the first Thursday in May. We're keeping it consistent 2 to 3 p.m. every single Thursday. Dr. Marsh, it has been so good to have you with us again. You are one of our most favorite frequent flyers. I don't even know how many times we've had you for events, but we are so grateful for your time and energy. And again, for people watching, if you're not familiar with Dr. Marsh, not just her book is extraordinary. I really encourage you to read it. I loved it. I have a copy. You can reach out to me. I'll even lend it to you. It's so good. But also, Dr. Marsh does all kinds of work around Prince George's County. She does police community relations. She does all kinds of community moderation. Is just a fantastic resource for all of us. And so I do want to also take a moment and thank you, Dr. Marsh, for all you do all around Prince George's County. You really are an incredible person.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Vivian, for your comments. Thank you for all the listeners. Whenever you need me to be back, I will be back. But you will have some great scholars coming in 2024, and I'm so excited to be a part of those conversations and discussions.
All right, awesome. And so thank you. And again, check our website, check the library's website, and you'll be able to keep up with us as this goes on. Dr. Marsh, thank you. Andrea, thank you so much for being here. And to the library and the University of Maryland, thank you very much for this partnership for this series. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.